Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Ask Dave. A reader asked me, and this is actually a very interesting question, why is it that composers lump together movements into larger works instead of just describing them as separate pieces, especially since most people like the separate pieces unequally. That is, you'll love the first movement of a symphony, but you may not like the third movement of the symphony. Well, it's a very interesting question, actually, and it has a practical answer and an aesthetic answer. And I actually think it's worth going into because, a lot of people come to classical music for the first time and they see all of these multi-sectional pieces, the sections being called movements, not songs or other things like that. And they're wondering, what are they all doing together? And I listened to the first movement, Beethoven's Fifth, and that was really cool. And then I want to hear the second movement. Well, it sounds totally different, totally unrelated. Well, let's start with the practical reason. The practical reason is really about money, as practical reasons often are. I mean, if you're, an aristocrat keeping up with the other aristocrats, and you spend a fortune hiring musicians or putting together your own private orchestra or ensemble, this was back in the day. And today, if you have, a full-size symphony orchestra and you're a tax-free corporation and you're paying union scale, it really only makes sense to have these people giving a concert that takes a certain amount of time. So you're going to spend a certain amount of time. We've decided that, right? You need to be entertained. You want to be amused. You want to get your money's worth. You want to make sure these people are working for a living. Well, it makes sense to assume that they're going to arrange the items in a concert in a particularly satisfying or enjoyable way. Let's take something popular like a rock concert, like Taylor Swift running around recently. She just finished her tour. She's not doing symphonies. She's not doing large works made up of smaller works, but she is doing concerts made up of smaller works, smaller songs, and she's arranged them. She's arranged them in an order that she believes will be satisfying to her audience, which means contrast between the subject matter of the songs, between fast, slow, loud, soft, sad, happy, emotional attributes. All of those things are going to be mixed up to show her range as an artist and to show everything that music her way can do. Well, why should a composer not do the same thing? Back at the dawn of time, when instrumental music was just beginning, we're not talking about vocal music now, we're talking about abstract instrumental music, things were lumped together by key. Everything was in the same key. It was a way to relate things together and have them operate satisfactorily. And within that key, there would be a scheme of contrast between fast and slow and loud and soft. You would have the Baroque dance suite, for example, in A major. And all the dances would basically be in A major. Maybe a couple wouldn't be, just for contrast. But basically, that's what you had. However, as time wore on, and composers started exploring what music could do formally, and movements got longer, and concerts got longer, and people wanted more bang for their buck. They began to figure out ways to unify things. And that brings us to the aesthetic principle. The aesthetic principle is that the reason large works have multiple sections is because those sections relate to each other in some way. They relate to each other either by a balance of contrasts, paradoxically. In other words, they relate to each other because they're different, but they're different in a way which creates a satisfying whole, or they relate to each other much more concretely. They share themes, they share ideas, they share styles, they share forms, they share all kinds of things. If you've been following my Haydn Symphony Crusade, for example, one of the things that we discover is that Haydn symphonies were all written as unified works. And they consist of building blocks that Haydn uses in various ways. And so just because a movement ends, that doesn't mean that a composer has exhausted the potential of their material. That doesn't mean they've done everything they felt that they could do. And some of these things can be transformed in ways which are totally opposite. Something that was happy can be sad. Something that was fast can be slow. But they're related. And the more you listen, the more that relationship becomes apparent. You know, the initial questioner said to me that when listening to a symphony, for example, he doesn't hear any relationship between the various movements. Well, that's a function of how well you listen. Because normally there is a relationship. That relationship may not be obvious at first, but it's there. And the better you know the music, if you're dealing with really great composers, the more related things tend to sound. And I can only tell you that based on experience. You know, once you know the works really well, you'll begin to hear those relationships, and you'll begin to miss not hearing the relationships. One very interesting explanation for the reason that multi-movement works exist was given by the great British musicologist, critic, scholar, performer, composer Donald Francis Tovey. He said that the reason that you have multi-movement works is because the forms of each movement complete themselves more quickly than the emotional reactions that they engender. In other words, they leave you wanting more. The movement ends and you think, oh, there's got to be something else. And so we get more. And then finally, when we hear the last movement, we shouldn't want any more. In other words, that should be a very strong feeling, of completeness and finality and ending. And we've had a complete meal. That's actually a very good analogy, because a symphony is like a multi-course meal. You've got your appetizer, your entrees, your dessert, your entremet, your salad, your hors d'oeuvres, your side dishes. You've got all of those things. It's the same theory. All together, you have a meal. If you just had, crackers with chopped liver on them, you wouldn't have a meal. It wouldn't be satisfying. You'd want the rest of the meal. So we've been trained in our, sort of classical music culture to expect meals for the most part, not little hors d'oeuvres, not bits of things that go together harmoniously. But the contrast is part of the point. So you're absolutely right, asker, when you say that initially, at least, the various movements of a symphony may not sound like they have anything to do with each other. They sound contrasted, but that doesn't mean they don't have anything to do with each other. They could have quite a bit to do with each other. And that's something you need to keep in mind. The better you listen, the more you'll understand what those things that they have to do with each other are. I'm not sure I accept, by the way, Tovey's explanation that the emotional reaction extends beyond the end of the movement. I mean, the end of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony's first movement is pretty final as far as I'm concerned. And even if you wanted more, you may not want the second movement that Beethoven gives us. I mean, it's a very personal thing. Everybody has their own subjective impression and reaction to the music that they've just heard. I happen to think that by the time you get to the finale of Beethoven's Fifth, you begin to understand that there's an emotional trajectory that the music is following that's from tragedy to triumph, and that there are episodes in between that encompass different emotional states, and that the whole package is extremely satisfying. It really is. It fills 35 minutes or so very, very, very effectively, and I think with a wonderful feeling of completeness. But you may not feel that way, and if you don't feel that way, you don't have to listen that way. You don't have to listen to all four movements. But I will say categorically and dogmatically, you will be better off if you do. You will enjoy the experience more if you do. You will get more out of it. And that first movement that initially sounded so final when you first heard it will have a natural place in the larger scheme of things. So when you're just getting started, or if you're a approaching these things for the first time, you're right to feel that these may be 4 or 3 or 2 or however many, 10 completely separate pieces, and you'll like some better than you'll like others. That's natural. It's normal. I mean, I still feel that way about some pieces. I really do. I mean, the slow movement of Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony, which everybody thinks is gorgeous, I think is about 10 minutes too long. It's all an individual taste and your own emotional, composition, how you respond to the music. But these things have a purpose, and that's the thing to keep in mind. Composers who know what they're doing put these things together with great care and skill, and with the intention that they belong together in some way. And the way that they belong together is one of the great, finding that out is one of the great joys of listening to classical music. So I hope this answers your question. I think that, like I said, there's the practical side and there's the aesthetic side. And they're related, obviously. And your own approach is going to be your own approach. You have every right and justification to do it in the way that's most comfortable for you. But always keep in mind that one of the reasons we listen to these things constantly in multiple performances and all of that stuff is because of this idea of relatedness, the reality of relatedness. It's not really just a concept, it's a fact. These things are related. They do belong together. They fit together in a certain way. And if you care about that and want to discover it, all you have to do is listen. You don't have to do anything else. You just have to listen until it fits. That's it. And it will. I guarantee it. I promise you. It will. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.